September 15, 1943. Willow Run Plant, Michigan. 6:47 in the morning. The factory floor stretches endlessly under fluorescent lights that flicker like dying stars. Marcus Thompson wipes grease from his hands and stares at 20 wooden barracks sitting empty behind the main assembly line. For 3 months, these structures have gathered dust, built for worker housing that never materialized. Management calls them a waste of space. Marcus sees something else entirely. Something that will transform how America builds its flying fortresses. He approaches his supervisor, a man who barely acknowledges his existence most days. "What if," Marcus says quietly, "we turn those barracks into something useful?" The supervisor doesn't even look up from his clipboard. But Marcus continues anyway, because sometimes the most revolutionary ideas sound like the simplest mistakes. What if we use them for pre-assembly? Break down the B-17 construction into smaller, specialized sections. The supervisor finally glances up, his expression mixing confusion with mild irritation. In 1943, black workers don't typically offer engineering suggestions. They follow orders, operate machines, clean up after the important work is done. But Marcus has been watching this factory struggle for months, missing production quotas while perfectly good space sits empty. He's beginning to understand something that the engineers haven't figured out yet. This is the story of how exclusion bred innovation, how the smartest idea came from someone nobody was listening to, and how 20 forgotten barracks became the secret weapon that helped win a war. In the autumn of 1943, America faced a brutal mathematical problem. The war in Europe demanded B-17 flying fortresses faster than any factory could produce them. Each bomber required approximately 400,000 individual parts, assembled with precision that would make a Swiss watchmaker weep. Ford Motor Company's Willow Run plant, stretching over 3 million square feet, represented industrial ambition on an unprecedented scale. Henry Ford himself had promised to build 1 bomber every hour. But reality had other plans. The traditional method of aircraft construction followed centuries-old principles borrowed from shipbuilding. Start with a frame, add components piece by piece, test everything at the end. It worked for smaller aircraft, for peacetime production, for industries that could afford patience. But war doesn't wait for perfection, and the men dying over Europe couldn't wait for traditional manufacturing methods to evolve naturally. Meanwhile, the workforce itself reflected America's contradictions. Black workers had migrated north in unprecedented numbers, drawn by promises of industrial employment and escape from Jim Crow restrictions. Yet even in Michigan, segregation followed them into the factory. Black workers operated specific machines, used separate facilities, received different treatment from supervisors who viewed their labor as necessary but their opinions as irrelevant. The irony was mathematical. The very people excluded from decision-making processes often understood the work itself better than anyone else. Marcus Thompson embodied this contradiction. Before the war, he'd worked construction in Alabama, building houses with crews that could frame an entire structure in a single day by breaking complex tasks into simple, repeatable steps. When he arrived at Willow Run, he immediately recognized inefficiencies that seemed invisible to the engineers with college degrees and manufacturing theories. The problem wasn't the workers, it was the system. The B-17 flying fortress represented engineering magnificence. 4 Wright R-1820 Cyclone engines generating 200 horsepower each. Wingspan of 103 feet. Maximum bomb load of 8,000 pounds. Range sufficient to strike deep into German territory and return home. But magnificence, Marcus realized, didn't require complexity in manufacturing. It required intelligence in organization. Every day, he watched partially assembled aircraft move slowly down the main line, workers crowding around each bomber, tools and parts scattered across vast floor space, multiple trades trying to accomplish overlapping tasks in the same confined area. Bottlenecks developed when electrical work interfered with hydraulic installation, when gun mounting conflicted with radio equipment placement. The engineers called these problems inevitable. Marcus saw them as solvable. Those 20 barracks represented possibility that management couldn't perceive. Built solidly, with good lighting, adequate space for tool storage and material organization. Originally designed for temporary worker housing, they sat empty because transportation logistics had changed, because workers had found housing elsewhere, because bureaucracy moves slower than necessity. But Marcus saw something different when he looked at them. He saw specialized assembly stations. What if, instead of building each bomber from start to finish in one location, they broke the process into distinct phases? What if each barrack handled specific sub-assemblies? Wing sections, tail assemblies, engine mounts, electrical systems, defensive armament? What if workers could become specialists in particular aspects, rather than generalists struggling with everything simultaneously? The idea violated conventional wisdom about aircraft manufacturing. Engineers insisted that complex systems required integrated assembly, that breaking the process into components would create quality control problems, that coordination between separate facilities would introduce more delays than it eliminated. But Marcus had built houses, and he understood that complexity often masks simplicity, that the most difficult tasks become manageable when properly divided. His first ally came from an unexpected source. Dorothy Chen, a Chinese-American engineer who faced her own forms of workplace exclusion, overheard Marcus explaining his idea to another worker during a lunch break. Most engineers would have dismissed such suggestions immediately. But Dorothy had learned to recognize good ideas regardless of their source. She approached Marcus quietly, away from supervisors who might disapprove of such collaboration. "Show me exactly what you're thinking," she said, producing a pencil and paper. Marcus sketched roughly, his construction experience translating into manufacturing terms that Dorothy could refine with engineering precision. Together, they developed specifications that transformed his intuitive understanding into technical proposals that management might actually consider. The first barrack conversion happened almost by accident. Production delays had created a backlog of wing assemblies that couldn't be completed on the main line due to space constraints. Dorothy suggested moving this specific work to Barracks 7, ostensibly as a temporary solution to immediate problems. She didn't mention that the arrangement followed Marcus's systematic approach. She simply presented it as practical emergency management. Within 3 days, wing assembly productivity increased by 40%. Workers could focus exclusively on specific tasks without interference from other trades. Tools and parts could be organized for maximum efficiency rather than general accessibility. Quality control improved because inspectors could specialize in particular components rather than attempting to evaluate entire aircraft systems simultaneously. Success bred expansion. Barrack 12 became dedicated to tail section assembly. Barrack 15 handled defensive armament installation. Barrack 3 specialized in electrical systems. Each conversion refined the process, eliminated additional inefficiencies, created opportunities for worker expertise that the traditional system had never allowed. Marcus found himself consulting unofficially on each conversion, his construction background providing insights that engineering theory couldn't anticipate. Which workflows would create bottlenecks? How should tools be arranged for maximum efficiency? What sequences would minimize worker movement and maximize productivity? Questions that seemed simple, but required practical experience to answer correctly. The racial dynamics created their own complications. White supervisors struggled to acknowledge that innovative solutions were coming from black workers and Chinese engineers, groups they'd been trained to view as capable of following instructions but incapable of providing leadership. Some actively resisted changes that would require them to admit their own limitations. Others grudgingly accepted improvements while refusing to credit their sources. But productivity numbers don't lie. By December 1943, Willow Run was producing B-17s at rates that exceeded Ford's original promises. The 20 Barracks system had transformed aircraft manufacturing from artisan craft to industrial process, breaking complex assembly into manageable components that workers could master completely rather than understand partially. The transformation extended beyond mere efficiency. Workers who had been interchangeable parts in traditional assembly became specialists with genuine expertise. A riveter in Barrack 9 knew more about wing construction than most engineers. An electrician in Barrack 3 could troubleshoot systems faster than factory supervisors. The specialization that Marcus had envisioned created opportunities for professional development that the old system had actively prevented. Yet recognition remained complicated by the social hierarchies that the system had challenged, but not eliminated. Official credit for the innovations went to management personnel who had eventually endorsed the changes. Dorothy Chen received some acknowledgement for her engineering contributions, though less than male colleagues might have expected for similar work. Marcus Thompson's role remained largely invisible in official documentation, mentioned only indirectly in reports that praised worker input, without identifying specific contributors. The irony was profound. The same exclusionary thinking that had initially dismissed Marcus's suggestions ultimately prevented recognition of his contributions. The system could accept innovation from excluded groups when desperate necessity demanded results, but crediting such innovation would require acknowledging the wisdom that exclusion typically overlooked. Meanwhile, the B-17s rolling off the Willow Run production line carried this hidden history into European skies. Bombers, whose construction had been revolutionized by a black construction worker's insight, flew missions over Germany. Their crews unaware that their aircraft represented not just American industrial capacity, but American social contradictions. The same country that could innovate brilliantly when necessity demanded it could also systematically waste human potential through prejudice and institutional blindness. The mathematical impact was undeniable. Before the Barracks system, Willow Run produced approximately 42 B-17s per month. After full implementation, production peaked at over 150 bombers monthly. The difference measured in aircraft translated directly into lives saved, missions completed, strategic objectives achieved. The smartest idea had become quantifiable victory. But the human impact extended beyond statistics. Workers who had been relegated to simple tasks discovered capabilities they hadn't known they possessed. The specialization system revealed talents that traditional manufacturing had never allowed to develop. Men and women who entered the factory as interchangeable labor emerged as skilled craftspeople with professional pride in their specific contributions to complex technological systems. Dorothy Chen parlayed her role in the innovations into post-war engineering opportunities that previous generations of Chinese-American women couldn't have imagined. The war had created spaces for previously excluded talent, and some of those spaces remained open when peace returned. Her career became evidence that temporary necessity could sometimes create permanent change. Marcus Thompson's story proved more complicated. After the war, industrial employment opportunities for black workers contracted as returning veterans reclaimed positions and social hierarchies reasserted themselves. The construction skills that had enabled his manufacturing insights remained relevant, but the recognition that might have opened doors to engineering or management positions never materialized. His contribution to American industrial capacity became historical footnote rather than career foundation. The 20 barracks themselves outlasted their original purpose. Some became storage facilities for peacetime production. Others housed different manufacturing processes as Ford transitioned from military to civilian production. A few were eventually demolished as industrial needs evolved. But their temporary transformation had proven something important about the relationship between innovation and inclusion, about the wisdom that emerges from unexpected sources when necessity creates opportunities for previously excluded voices to be heard. In 1947, Marcus Thompson returned to Alabama, where construction work offered steady employment and familiar challenges. He rarely spoke about his role in transforming B-17 production, partly because few people would have understood the significance, partly because the systems that had dismissed his contributions during the war remained largely unchanged afterward. The smartest idea became personal memory rather than public recognition. Yet the principle he had demonstrated lived on in manufacturing philosophy, even when its origins were forgotten. Breaking complex assembly into specialized components became standard practice across multiple industries. The insight that exclusion wastes potential influenced civil rights arguments about economic efficiency and social justice. The mathematical proof that diversity of perspective improves problem-solving became academic research topic and policy justification. The story asks uncomfortable questions about how many similar innovations never happened because potential contributors never gained access to decision-making processes. How many problems remained unsolved because the people best equipped to solve them were systematically excluded from opportunities to contribute? How many wars might have ended sooner? How many lives might have been saved? How many advances might have occurred earlier if societies had been willing to listen to voices they preferred to ignore? But it also demonstrates something hopeful about human adaptability and recognition. When necessity becomes sufficiently urgent, even prejudiced systems can temporarily suspend their limitations to accept wisdom from previously excluded sources. The challenge lies in making such recognition permanent rather than temporary, systematic rather than exceptional. Those 20 barracks represented more than industrial innovation. They embodied the possibility that the smartest ideas often come from the people nobody expects to have them. Marcus Thompson's insight didn't just transform B-17 production. It proved that exclusion is not just morally wrong, but practically wasteful, that societies function best when they create space for all voices to contribute their unique perspectives to common challenges. The empty barracks that had seemed worthless became the foundation for manufacturing revolution, just as the excluded voices that seemed irrelevant became sources of solutions that included perspectives could never have imagined. Sometimes the smartest idea comes from someone nobody was listening to, and sometimes that's exactly when listening matters most. If this story makes you wonder what innovations we're missing because we're not listening to the right voices, if it makes you question whose ideas we're dismissing without consideration, then perhaps there are other stories of overlooked wisdom waiting to be discovered, other examples of how inclusion creates better solutions than exclusion ever could.